LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Mark Corske, who joins us to discuss his book, Engines of Domination, Political Power and the Human Emergency. Is political power, that is, armed central authority with states in war, really necessary for human society? Or is it a tool that ruling elites use to live at the expense of everyone else? Engines of Domination offers a theory of political power as a tool, an engine that converts human energy into power and privilege for the rulers. Invented in the Bronze Age and ruthlessly refined for 6,000 years, today this engine threatens to destroy our world in a human emergency of converging political and economic crises, resource depletion and environmental destruction. Applying his theory of political power to Western history, Corske makes a passionate argument that there is only one way to respond to this emergency. Armed central authority must be abolished, giving way to a world of peaceful, voluntary communities. 6,000 years of violence and chaos, of abusive power and plundered privilege is more than long enough. It's time for something better. Hello and welcome, Mark, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greg, it's wonderful to be here. I've been really looking forward to this.
Wonderful. Well, today, Mark, we're going to discuss your book, which is entitled Engines of Domination, a subtitle, Political Power and the Human Emergency. Before we get into that, perhaps you could just tell listeners a bit about your background and your life story, because it seems that you've come quite a long way from your early life to the position, the sort of philosophical position that you find yourself in now.
It has been quite a long way, and it's been quite an indirect way. As far as political power, I really started thinking about it when I was a child, in the sense that I was terrified by what was going on in the world, in the United States, even as a little boy. The nuclear arms race had just begun. We watched newsreels of atomic tests. People were selling fallout shelters. There were civil defense movies we watched in school, and in particular this horrifying little government film called Duck and Cover, with a little cute turtle who taught the kids how to crouch down and cover their heads in case a nuclear bomb went off at any moment. And I understood what this meant. I had a pretty good grasp of science and I think an exceptional imagination for a kid my age. And it just terrified me to realize that every day I walked to school, there could be that blinding flash in the sky and it would all be over in the most horrible possible way. And I knew even then that couldn't be right, that something horrible was going on, although I had no idea what. So from that start, I wandered off into some kind of philosophical dead ends with my first serious thinking. I became enraptured with the ideas of Ayn Rand for a few years. Later rejected that completely, but it was my first real experience of some kind of systematic philosophy, and that just lit me on fire. And from then on, through all the other things I did, I kept thinking very seriously about the world and what it was that was wrong, was so terribly wrong. The Vietnam War was going on in my late teens and early 20s, all the other wars in Indochina. And I didn't really understand it, but it was clear to me that the huge power structures behind it all, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, were the problem. That without these things, none of this terrible stuff could be happening, and I had an intuition that they weren't necessary, that we didn't have to have these great, huge military states that could destroy the world. So I became an anarchist. Not that I wanted to tear the state down, but I thought we didn't need such a thing, and probably never needed it. And I began to realize there was probably little chance that we were going to be around for much longer if we didn't somehow get rid of it. Then I took a big excursion into mathematics and physics, which was inspired by some work done by a Princeton physicist named Gerard O'Neill. He and some students in an advanced placement class of his had figured out that with the engineering technology of the mid-1970s, you could build enormous permanent orbiting habitats in space. And it seemed to me that maybe if something like that could happen, people could operate experimental communities in space and possibly find better ways of living than the ones that were threatening the world with total destruction. So I went back to school to learn a little bit of engineering, to follow this work of O'Neill's better, and just totally by surprise fell in love with math and physics and pursued that for 7 years. Pretty much stopped thinking about political philosophy and moved my attention completely to theoretical physics. But then the turning point was, for reasons that I'd really rather not go into, I was working with a spiritual advisor at the time, a Jesuit. And as you may know, the Jesuits, the core of the order is this remarkable little book by Ignatius called The Spiritual Exercises, where, among other things, you contemplate things very intensely. And after I'd worked with him for a year, he assigned me a final exercise, which was to contemplate the newspaper every morning. And that changed my life, because I quickly realized that I didn't understand why anything big was happening in the world. And the worse the things were happening, the less I understood why they were happening. So that set me off on a quest to figure it out for myself. I'd been trained in a method of teaching and doing mathematics called the Moore method, where you give the students a bunch of definitions and axioms, and you ask them to prove things for themselves. You have them learn for themselves how to build mathematical systems out of these foundations, to think things through themselves. And I decided that's what I had to do with the news. So now I was in my mid-30s by this time when this happened. I'd actually quit school and gone back to school in my mid-20s. So that led me to very slowly began to get some kind of grip on what was happening in the world in terms of my own ideas. Took a long time to think them up. It was a very slow and at first very intuitive process, but by the time I moved here to New Mexico from Denver in the early 90s, the ideas were taking form. Then it was a matter of simplifying them, clarifying them, putting them in a form that could be easily understood, and then by the time I finished the book in 2008, I thought I really had it down to where anybody who read the book carefully could understand things the way I understood them. Not that I thought I had it right, but that I thought I had a definite and original way of looking at it that could at least help people think about political power in a different way, and hopefully think about it in better ways than I'd ever thought of it.
Now, in terms of the title of the book, I think when people see the words political power and domination in the same sentence, they understand clearly, and certainly you've highlighted that in what you just said. This human emergency aspect, I think that those two words together ring true for a lot of people in the age that we live in. But perhaps you could say just a little bit more about where we find ourselves right now, because as you point out in the book, we often misdiagnose the causes of the problems we find ourselves in globally.
Well, I think so, very much so. It's clear that we have problems that are intense enough and grave enough to call them an emergency. An emergency is some state of affairs that is so dire that it requires drastic action to avert it. The first and foremost of these conditions to me is the threat of nuclear war. There is nothing like nuclear weapons, and I find that very few people today really understand how different they are from conventional weapons. You think, a hydrogen bomb, it's just a big bomb. It's not just a big bomb. It does all kinds of things that ordinary bombs don't do, and big is hardly a word for it. One high-yield hydrogen bomb in the 10 to 20 megaton range could totally demolish a metropolis like London or Moscow or New York City in minutes. There's never been anything like it. There are on the order of 1,500 active nuclear weapons, I think, at present in the United States and Russia's arsenals. Most of them, in fact, probably none of them are as large as 20 megatons. The last time I checked, the warheads, the big warheads, were like 1 megaton. But this is enough firepower to bring civilization crashing down and to cause irreparable damage to the entire biosphere. So the threat of a nuclear war is a threat like humanity's never faced, and it's absolutely real right now, and the policies that are being pursued in Washington are dangerously provocative of that kind of thing. Then, of course, there's all the other dangers from nuclear technology in general. I live about 70 miles from the Los Alamos National Labs, where the nuclear bomb was first invented, and there are storage facilities there full of incredibly dangerous stuff, like I believe there's machine oil that was contaminated by machining plutonium at the old closed Rocky Flats plant in Denver, or near Denver. There are many other places where that stuff is piled up. Nuclear reactors create nuclear wastes that can't be safely disposed of or contained, like the reactor disaster in Japan has demonstrated. So the whole nuclear technology issue, but most of all nuclear weapons, pose the gravest, most intense long-term threat. And of course, there's the impact of industry on the environment, which is disastrous, between toxins and the effects of carbon emissions and so forth in causing global heating. As the climate changes, the entire economy of the world is going to have to change, and it's not going to change for the better as drought increases and famines begin, things like that. Contamination has tremendous health effects. I'm convinced that multiple toxins from various sources combine in highly nonlinear ways and are causing an awful lot of the chronic and degenerative diseases that are proliferating. So there's that ecological and biological aspect to the human emergency. As people become more crowded into cities and as global travel increases and increases, pandemics could strike at a scale that was never previously possible and with an incredible virulence, especially drug-resistant strains of things. That aspect of technology has encouraged the prevalent use of antibiotics and so forth. So there's a biological aspect too to the human emergency. And then finally, I think there's a profoundly spiritual aspect. The culture of the world is increasingly being infused and dominated by the Western corporate consumerist culture. And it's not a good culture for the human spirit. It as I'm sure almost everyone knows, it concentrates all the energy of life on acquisition and production and keeping busy and things that are very far from what makes life meaningful and significant. It divides the communities. It shreds the community's deepest bonds by preventing the kinds of networks of deep and traditional associations that have been the foundation of human community since the beginning. So that, in a nutshell, that's what I think the human emergency is. As different as all of those aspects may be, I think they can all be traced to the increase of political power over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. War and weapons would certainly not be possible without states. The technology that's being employed in industry that's causing the damage is much more serving corporate profit than human well-being. It's very hard to argue that a substance like Teflon, for instance, which was first developed for one of the nuclear reactors, creating the fuel for the nuclear attacks on Japan, and puts this carcinogen C8, I think, out in the environment, it's very hard to argue that that's serving any kind of human need. It was produced by DuPont for a military purpose, and then it was distributed commercially strictly to make money. You can't say people need stick-proof frying pans so much that they're willing to have C8 in their blood and suffer higher cancer rates. And power and profit are intrinsically tied into political power today in a way they never were, yet they always have been, and increasingly since the mercantile revolution in the 15th and 16th centuries, when what we call modern capitalism began. So all of these aspects of the human emergency fundamentally depend on extremely powerful institutions of political power dominating the world. The technology that's caused them, I don't think, would ever have been turned in the directions that have caused it to be so destructive if it hadn't been exploited by those in power for purposes that didn't have anything to do with human well-being.
Well, of course, a lot of people listening to that diagnosis will say, well, this is human nature, and, it's always been like that. And yet there's a curious paradox here, because I don't know anybody who wants war, who wants exploitation, degradation, the things that you describe, and I'm sure you don't. And if we meet anyone who says that they do, generally they're parroting a position perhaps that they've picked up from their political party they subscribe to, or maybe the evening news, or someone who's got very opinionated views they've been talking to in a bar. But very few people honestly in their hearts desire these things, and yet here we have them. And of course you trace through the ages how this has come to be, and it's in exactly this concentration of control and power.
Well, so the critical question is, does this arise from human nature the way that deer trails arise from deer running through the woods, or birds' nests arise from birds? Or is it something that's certainly possible to human nature, but that may actually run against it? And this is my view. First of all, it has not always been this way. Before the Bronze Age, until about 6,000 years ago, human communities showed very little evidence of intense concentrations of power and privilege. The world was much more cooperative and peaceful than it is today. It certainly wasn't a paradise. But if you look at Neolithic towns, you find that there aren't distinguished graves for rulers stocked with riches. You don't find the ruins of temples or palaces. All the houses are the same. You find the first distinguished structure in Neolithic communities is the granary, where they store the grain. It's not a temple, it's not a palace, it's a place that is centered on the community's life support. Then very, very quickly, over a period of about 1,000 years, the temples appear, the palaces appear, the walled cities appear, the art begins to show warriors and battle, and something completely different happens. I think we have to understand that for something like 97% of our 250,000-year family history, things weren't like this at all. Again, they weren't perfect. There were certainly conflicts. There was certainly some inequality, although I don't know any evidence to that effect. I don't doubt that it's the case. But the inequality and conflict and the rise of domination has only been in the last few percent of our family history. So what happened? Is that some trait of human nature that took a very long time to appear and suddenly 6,000 years ago emerged, something kind of like puberty in a developing human being? I think not. I think we're basically a cooperative and ingenious species who made it through tremendous hardships for 250,000 years by basically sticking together and putting the common good of communities first, not private well-being, not me getting what I can at your expense. I think what happened 6,000 years ago was that one of the distinctive traits of our species got turned to destructive ends. We're domesticators. We domesticated plants and animals at least 10,000 years ago, maybe 30,000 years ago. Animals and some cultivated plants were involved in human communities. I think what happened 6,000 years ago was that possibly gradually and unintentionally, or possibly on purpose, some people figured out how to domesticate other human beings. And it was natural that they would. Although I say people are ingenious and cooperative, we're not saints. It's easy to want to have it a little better off than someone else, especially if it's not going to hurt them too much. So I think that the rise of political power 6,000 years ago, of what I call domination, was an innovation when organized groups of people learned how to domesticate their fellow human beings, learned how to domesticate whole communities. It might have even started for lofty reasons, for reasons that were somehow cloaked in terms of religion or something like that. But however it started, it's not human nature for one part of the community to thrive at the expense of the rest. Domesticating an ox is one thing, domesticating your neighbor is another, and domesticating a whole community is yet another. So I think this wonderful ability of ours to harness other sources of energy, to harness other forces of nature to our advantage, got perverted into something horrible, and that the rest of history, this last 6,000 years that most people think is how it's always been, is that innovation being refined and amplified and applied at a larger scale and intensity. So, sure, people don't want it. People never wanted it. It wasn't like one day everyone got together and said, okay, 99% of us will work for the rest of for the 1%, or half of us will be slaves and you guys will be masters. It was imposed on people by institutions that were engineered to have that effect.
And of course, we see the continuation of that right to the very day, in the sense that the average person, you or I, for example, we don't want to rule, to have power and control over others. We want to work with them for mutual benefit. And so, as you say, some people may always have a little bit more than others, but generally things are relatively egalitarian when left to their own devices. And it's one of the reasons, of course, people look for leaders. But there's a difference between, say, for example, being in a Neolithic tribe and having, saying to one of the tribe, will you lead us on the hunt because you're so good at this, please? And them taking that role on as an honor to be asked to do that, and which comes with responsibility. There's a big difference between that and people basically being told that, you're feckless, you're useless, you're cattle, you have to be led. And you see that everywhere today. People turn on the television and they listen to people in dark suits and say, what's he going to say? What's reality? What should we do? You're
absolutely right. We're in a population that's largely been domesticated, and for thousands of years, it's totally natural. We don't think, do we need rulers? We ask, which rulers should we have? We don't think, do we need a political power structure that's armed to destroy the world and out to serve interests that we can't understand? We ask which way it should work. We don't ask, is it really, is the effort to survive necessarily a matter of getting up and marching off to a job where you do something that more benefits someone else than you and just gives you a piece of paper with a number written on it to come home with? Is that kind of work the only kind of work that could make communities thrive and work in a way that's good for human well-being? We're boxed in by this system of domestication that's evolved brilliantly over the ages. And it's very hard to break out of that way of thinking, or to think that anything else might be possible, partly because you're devoting all your energy in as you said, in the let's work together cooperative. How can you raise a good family? How can you be on good relations with your neighbors within that system? All your energy is focused into adapting to it, and that leaves none, very little at best, for thinking about it or challenging it.
And it's remarkable when you look at it how similar the methods for persuasion and coercion, intimidation, corruption have been over the millennia. They've simply been adapted, and the focus has shifted with each new age, each new century, whatever it happens to be, each new trend. And even, we still talk about today modern television and sports as bread and circuses, which of course is an echo of, the last days of Rome.
Yes, except they're much more widely accessible. Not everybody could go to the Colosseum.
No, that's true. That's true. But it's still remarkable, the analogies that are there. Even in the Dark Ages, this went on. It's retracted more and became more localized, but it was still the same structure.
Because it works. It's what works. If you're going to keep a flock of sheep, or you're going to keep cattle, or deal with horses, there's only certain ways that can work. You can't treat horses like dogs. You have to treat them like horses. You have to treat people like people, and there's only certain ways you can domesticate people. So, as you say, the fundamental ways it functions haven't really changed. The technologies have been refined, and the surface appearance has changed dramatically, but the function's still the same.
And another very important point in all of this that you highlight in the book is that over all this long period of time, right through the rise and fall of ages and times, for example, like the Dark Ages, when a lot of these elite power structures would have come under pressure for obvious reasons, that one of the common themes is that elites will work tirelessly for generations at building up and maintaining these structures and taking them through, making sure that they aren't completely dissolved. And this is something that a lot of, I don't want to use the phrase ordinary people, but a lot of people outside of those elites don't appreciate perhaps just how dedicated they are to their cause, if you want to put it that way.
Once you're in power, you stand to lose so much by losing power. And if you're born into it, like into the ruling classes of Europe, you're just as the common people are reared in a domesticated commoner's environment, so to speak, the ruling classes are brought up in a ruler's environment. And that imperative to remain in power at all costs and to increase power, because it's really dangerous to lose power. It can be fatal. To keep the power increasing, or to adapt the form of power to new conditions, that imperative is built into your way of thinking and into the institutions that you inherit a place in. So of course it works that way. Sometimes it's very gradual. Sometimes it happens fairly dramatically, like in the transition from serfdom to mercantile capitalism, or in the Industrial Revolution. There, over about 150 years, there was quite a change in the configuration of power, but it never skipped a beat. It adapted, because people are brilliant, and people in power are no less brilliant than anyone else. No more, but no less. And as challenges to their power arise, they seek out means of changing the institutions of power to meet those challenges. It doesn't take a conspiracy between some malevolent masterminds. It just takes a whole bunch of bright, highly motivated people trying to sustain their privilege through the changes that challenge them.
Now, people think let's think of a fictional elite, for example, here, a dark cabal. Let's take the Empire out of Star Wars. It's not just the Emperor, is it? It's not just the Emperor and his sidekick Darth Vader. There's a whole hierarchy of people that make these things happen, right down to stormtroopers who are actually, that might be a bit better built than you and I, but they're a lot like you and I in many ways. And our society, and indeed going right back to the origins of this that you describe, has functioned in this manner, and it's about getting people invested in the system enough so that, as you say, they want to maintain it, whether that's your number two to the head honcho, or whether you're just part of the lower reaches whose livelihood depends on this. And that's very clever in many ways, because it plays the sort of the middle and the bottom off against each other. It's kind of a divide and rule, and giving little bits of incentives to people. More incentives the farther up the ladder you go, but so everybody's invested in it. And it's a pyramid structure, and that's part of its weakness as well. But it's also, as we know, pyramids are incredibly strong structures.
Absolutely. I think it's important to see that class structures in general aren't the source of domination. It isn't as if somehow Neolithic communities, with all of their relative equality, somehow grew an elite up through strata of relatively unprivileged and then more privileged and more privileged people. I think all you need is an elite at the top to realize that it needs a loyal, privileged sector under it to support it. And then it needs an underclass beneath the privileged sector, so as you say, those two can fight against each other in a class war that you're not really a part of. Also, it's very important to realize that at the top it isn't just Darth Vader and the Emperor power structures almost always have ruling groups at their tops, even if most of the group or part is invisible. A tyrant needs advisors. A tyrant needs assistants. A tyrant very often represents a ruling clique that he personifies and represents to the people with the power invested in him. So you've got groups all through it. You have ruling groups, ruling elites at the top. Those have changed considerably over time. Now our ruling elite in the modern world tends to be, the top shareholders and the richest people at the top of the corporate power structure. And they are seldom directly involved in government, but they have enormous influence over it. You have the ruling groups at the top. Then you have some stratification of society for control purposes. And it's all a question of different kinds of groups, all practicing mutual aid within their group structure. The rulers help each other. The upper classes help each other. The middle classes help each other. The working poor, as much as they can, help each other. All of these strata working dynamically together stabilize and sustain the system. It can't just be one monster at the top and then all the poor little people being bossed around at the bottom. It's nothing like that.
No, you only have to think of what the US did. When I say the US, not as a nation, obviously, but certain factions within the US did to fund and equip the Nazis, for example.
Oh, yeah, and in Europe, too. I think the British Conservative Party was in on it, and the Phalange movement in France. The important thing is to stay in power. It doesn't matter so much who.
Yeah, and there's probably not very many Americans or any other world citizens, for that matter, who've looked up the footage. I can't remember where it was shot, but the Nazi rallies that were held prior to World War II, they were held in North America. Oh,
sure. The promise of the Nazi movement, I think, that is seldom emphasized, is that it was either created or swiftly commandeered to meet the challenge of socialism and communism and anarchism. It was really a huge threat at the times leading up to World War II. Worldwide, there were anarchist labor movements that were really threatening power, even in Japan and South America, certainly in the United States, and in Europe, especially in Germany and Italy and Spain. So here was a movement that superficially professed to address some of the same problems, but that was really dedicated to brutally crushing those threats to power. Again, it was an adaptive strategy that appealed to those who wanted to maintain their privilege against something that was threatening it.
Now, of course, we've seen this in historical examples. Rome is a good example, for example. I mean, that came undone, even though we said earlier that sort of domination in its various forms carried on, it has done since it first got established. But there are unintended consequences, and you've got a whole section of the book devoted to this, and certainly Rome was a victim of unintended consequences. So I think we're beginning to, I think they've always manifested themselves. We've seen them throughout our lifetimes, throughout the modern era. But perhaps you can say a little bit more about what those are, what types of unintended consequences there are in this sort of hierarchy, as opposed to specific ones which we're seeing now. But we can maybe come on to those a bit later.
Okay, well, let me back off and make it clear that the heart of my theory of political power, which constitutes the middle chapters of the book Engines of Domination, the heart of it is an attempt to spell out really precisely that you can understand political power as an engine, a device that converts energy into useful work. The energy to be converted is the energy of a community. And the useful work is to get the community to perform human actions that serve power and privilege first and foremost, and the community's well-being only secondarily. And an engine is a tool. The innovation that I described at the beginning of civilization was basically the invention of a tool for making tools of human beings. The purpose was to domesticate communities, so that's the intended consequence. But once you're doing that, you can't just harness the energy of a community and sit back and live happily ever after on a status quo, because first of all, you're going to exhaust the ability of the community to support you. Your institutions of power are going to put a big drain on resources and human energy that never existed in the community before. So you're going to reach a point where you don't have enough and you need more. You can work the people harder. That puts you at risk of insurrection or losing control. The simpler thing is, when you need more, you domesticate an external community, and that's war. So the very first unintended consequence of having created this tool is that you need to expand its reach, and the only way to expand its reach is through war. War is the first unintended consequence. I don't think the origin of domination may have involved things like violent takeovers of communities, but to speak of war in the sense of the political force, the military force of one community being inflicted on another in order to make it do what you want it to do, that was only possible once domination existed, so it wasn't the purpose. It was an unintended consequence. Once war is underway, a kind of horrible domino effect sets in, because if you have one aggressive regime in a region, the other regimes have to respond, and the only way to respond is either just to knuckle under and say, fine, we'll be your slaves, or to resist by becoming a more military and more strictly regimented kind of community yourself. So the pattern of this engine will propagate itself, even if no one ever meant it to. Power will propagate and intensify. When one regime conquers another, you get a bigger regime. So the amount of territory and the number of people that are under domination will increase. So the second unintended consequence is that power is going to intensify once it starts. And perhaps that's the clearest process you can see over history from Rome with something on the order of 50, 60 million subjects. Today we have countries like China and India with well over 1 billion. And from a reach of some tens of thousands of square miles, thousands of years ago now, the entire planet, without exception, is under the control of one governmental power or another. The intensity has greatly increased. And if you look at how many people are working to support those in power, to support the ruling elites today, the intensity of activity and the number of people performing it in an industrial country is unthinkably beyond what was going on under serfdom or slavery in the past. So in every sense, the intensity of domination has increased. Then perhaps the most important unintended consequence, or the most unintended consequence, is that all of this expansion and intensification and war costs the habitat more and more. There were costs to the habitat even as far back as Greece and Rome, where there was a lot of deforestation around the Mediterranean and so forth. But everything that you put into the engine's operation, military, industrial, and so forth, comes from somewhere, and it can only come from the habitat. And once you have industrialization and modern technology with its increasingly toxic side effects, then the habitat's not only bears the cost of depletion, it bears the cost of contamination and corruption and other kinds of destruction. So there's where the development of the human emergency follows directly from the unintended consequences of this apparently simple sounding tool to make communities into tools. Comes from the unintended consequences of that tool in continued operation, and they are inevitable.
So, historically, what is even if you just can generalize here, what's the response then of a dominant elite to unintended consequences when they actually begin to bite upon its own power and its own ability to control things? Because, again, we'll talk about the current situation a bit more in a little bit, but it just seems that it's almost like a go to hell in a handcart sort of response, despite the fact there's that imperative to maintain power. It seems that pressures come to bear that pull the elite in different directions. We must do this, but also we mustn't allow this to happen.
I don't know that there's any general pattern to how it works, because this is where the art of ruling really shows itself. The first imperative is to stay in power, but that often imposes other imperatives that cause their own kinds of local and particular problems. It's incredibly difficult, and in fact, as history shows, most regimes fail. Most regimes either run into problems when they're not managed brilliantly enough, or when what they do to solve one problem causes problems that are insoluble, or that have effects that were, or the solutions have effects that caused worse problems than the ones that they were in attempt to solve. Generally, regimes fail, and generally not after a very long time. The ones that thrive, I mean, the peak of Rome only lasted a few hundred years, although the empire had started, before the empire, Rome had existed for a long time. The ones that survive a long time are really exceptional and have usually gone through some cataclysmic transformations. The ones we're looking at in the world today, especially the United States, is a baby on the scene. We have no idea what kinds of challenges, how it's going to meet the kinds of challenges that it's going to face here in the next few decades. And neither do the people in power, because even though they're always doing this very difficult dance to remain in power, that's the prime imperative. The last thing they're going to do is just give up power, unless they get into a very unusual circumstance, which is kind of my hope about changing the world, if there's any way to do it.
It's interesting that you used the phrase with regards to the US as baby on the scene, because a lot of commentary that I read and listen to, and indeed quite a few people I've had on here as guests, are very much of the end of empire type talk. You know what I mean? That not quite that America's finished, but that its expansion at the rate it has been so far cannot continue. It's going to have to pull back, contract. The country's bankrupt, etc., etc. So it's they've certainly never mentioned it being early days, you know, despite there being enormous problems.
Well, it's certainly early days compared with England or Germany or France, where they're, you know, through all of the upheavals and changes, there's still a common cultural heritage and an awful lot of historical experience that is lacking in the United States. I'm not so sure about the end of empire. The United States government is an instrument that's used by corporate power primarily. It's sure possible that the United States' role in expanding and primarily managing this increasing corporate empire may be cut back in the future. And it's obvious that the United States economy is withering in this race to the bottom to basically impose the same kinds of advantages that corporate power has in dealing with a third world country on more and more of the United States. So the United States government may not play such a big part in the future political scene 10, 20 years, 30 years down the road, if we're still here. But the powers that it represents will have the corporate power that it represents will have invested will have other strong arm organizations working to protect them and to carry out their interests. One of the most brilliant things about the modern system we have is that it's so easy to think that the government is the problem, when the problem is that the government is an extremely powerful instrument that's being used by powerful interests.
Yes, there's the idea that Obama sits behind the Oval Desk kind of deciding everything, which of course is ludicrous, and it's the same with most governments. I suspect somebody like Vladimir Putin does actually decide a great deal, maybe in consultation with a couple of Darth Vader type figures, but certainly most governments are, as you say, it's above and beyond the talking heads that come out and make statements to the press.
Yeah, and the corporate interests that have gotten so powerful through the United States and that still rely on it primarily to advance their interests, they know that it's dangerous to have all your eggs in one basket. It's much better to diversify, and the U.S. government may outlive its usefulness as the dominant means of enforcing their interests on the world, but they will continue to enforce their interests on the world as long as they can.
It's interesting, we've been talking about analogies with Rome how Rome used to behave as it went about conquest, and its preferred means was kind of assimilation. That you would be brought in as a Roman protectorate, and you would basically become part of the empire. Some of your resources, of course, would flow back to the motherland, but you would be assimilated for the greater good of the empire. But if you wouldn't fall in line, then you were crushed. And just thinking about how the US has gone about its dealings with, particularly in the Middle East, but in Central and South America and what have you, and it's sort of what seems to me as a non-expert a sort of similar pattern. It's like play ball. Okay, your leaders won't play ball, so we'll install a puppet. That works for a while. Then and at some point it's kind of like, okay, you will play ball, but or we're just going to knock you over the head, and that a military force basically.
It's the same mechanism Rome used. I suspect that Rome offered more enticements to more of the peoples that it conquered than the modern system does. The incitements are offered to the business interests and the financial interests in the countries that it's using for puppets. The common people generally don't get much out of it. But you can't run everything. You can be a dominant influence, and you can keep steering the course of events in the direction that serves your interests. But the world is, even Europe and Northern Africa and the Near East under Rome, that was vastly more than any kind of central power could directly manage in an effective way. It had to be by installing or assimilating local powers and giving them something in exchange for the tyranny that you were imposing on them. Trade, law, plumbing, whatever, computers, cell phones, video games.
Now, to some extent, if you look at the domination theory, and actually how things have played out, but in a theoretical way, you would say, okay, if this was a board game, then the logical end would be it would end up as a one-world system, because that would achieve more stability. You wouldn't have, for example, competing political blocs, like, for example, you had in the Cold War, and there's other examples like that. In the Imperial Age, world empires competing against each other. If you had one world hierarchy along the lines you described, then that could actually achieve a degree of stability that could last a long, long time. But that's never happened. Even Rome, couldn't dream of that. There's a lot of talk about one world government in various circles, conspiratorial and otherwise. But do you think that is a sort of a logical end if you were playing this out as a board game? And do you think that would even be possible? Or are there just too many human elements in it, too many competing elements?
I think theoretically, I suppose from a management point of view, what I call the human anthill, or something like a world state, would be the simplest and in the long term maybe the most stable form, but I'm not sure. Because part of what stabilizes our system is conflict. You can unite the people with the government when the government's at war with someone evil. And since war has been built into this system now for 6,000 years, I see a couple factors that make the world state pretty unlikely unless it were to arise after some great collapse. First, there's too much profit in war. This is a contradiction built into the system, maybe, that a unified single world management might be simplest, but all of the power in the world now rests on conflict. I mean, I often hear people saying, I just don't understand what the United States is doing. They're sending these drones in and killing children, and then it's just horrible. And I'm afraid I have to tell them, well, it makes perfect sense if you're out to manufacture an unlimited supply of future enemies. This is how to do it. This is how to create the hate that will last for countless generations and keep the wars going. So much of the way the system works now is based on having enemies. And if the enemies disappeared, whole industries, would collapse, fortunes would vanish. So there's that internal contradiction. Also, people aren't going to give up fighting. People, not just the people who've been so monstrously hurt, but people who just want control of their own lives, who just want control of their own lands, who just want to manage their own affairs. I don't know how that conflict could possibly be quashed so that you could have this peaceful world state.
Well, you also address in the book some of the ways that it's different this time, in the sense that over the ages, particularly the last few centuries, well, since the Industrial Revolution, really things have moved on apace with the development of weapons, particularly nuclear, obviously. Energy sources, again, nuclear, also the fossil fuel revolution since, say, industrial times. How far things have moved with technology, and also the establishment of corporations like never before. This is the whole structure above and beyond government that we're talking about. And of course, the rights that corporations have, if not granted themselves, then paid other people to grant them. And then, of course, there's the money system, the incredible power that has, which is ironic for something that's so illusory these days. In fact, I was watching a movie that I hadn't watched for a while the other night. It was the third in the Godfather trilogy, which is the least well regarded of the three, and I think that may partly be because it's so truthful. And at one point, one of the Vatican bankers says to one of the mafia types, finance is a weapon and politics is knowing when to pull the trigger. And of course, the final part of all this picture is the sheer scale that all of these developments that I've mentioned are on. And that plays into this whole idea of the human emergency, because it makes a lot of the problems we're seeing so much more acute and urgent.
No, we've never been in a situation like this. It hasn't just been a change of scale. It's been a change of design and intensity. And it certainly cannot go on as it's going now much longer without some kind of huge change.
It's always been that tendency we've described for the elites to want to do less and have more. But we've talked about, diminishing returns. And I think that that's particularly applicable right now, because all the factors I mentioned a moment ago, I think they've contributed to our global systems being incredibly complex. And this is an issue that I think a lot of writers and researchers are addressing at the minute, that it takes, I think a lot of our systems are so less resilient than they would have been on a smaller, more local scale. And the potential for things to go very badly wrong very quickly, I think, is not appreciated by most of us.
We have no idea what can or will happen. We're in blue skies. That's absolutely true. To me, trying to predict the future, trying to foresee what's going to happen, is at best just very vague guesswork, because of human ingenuity. Things that we cannot imagine people thinking of will be thought of. Things we can't imagine people doing will be done on both sides of this struggle, both on the oppressive side and on the side of humanity at large. And we are dealing with systems that certainly could break down in ways that nothing has ever been able to break down before. We're dealing with popular pressures that could burst forth with manifestations that no one has ever anticipated. I don't even try to imagine it. I know we must try as hard as we can to throttle back the most destructive things and to build constructive things as well as we can. But all bets are off about what's going to happen on this planet in the next, maybe even in the next decade, but certainly in the next generation.
Yeah, so I want to turn to future prospects and what we can perhaps do about this. But in light of what you just said a second ago, we have a lot of paralysis at the minute, particularly amongst the general citizenry, and something you describe in the book is the Medusa Effect.
Yes, how it can paralyze you to look at it. The reality is so horrible it can paralyze you to look at it.
Exactly, and it's how we move on from that. I think it's one of the perennial problems, really, with whether it's environmental movement or economic reform or campaigners for peace or nuclear free, whatever it happens to be. There's certainly action being taken there, but it's trying to mobilize individuals who feel completely powerless to understand they can do something, and that individual actions, it's kind of like the butterfly effect. It may not appear to do anything, but it does in its own little way. But to a counsel just for despair is not really going to move us forward at all.
No, it'll just guarantee that we're destroyed. I'm very much afraid, Craig, that what improving our chances for the future depends on are disasters. The complacency or that so many people seem to have, and how deeply absorbed they have to be in their own survival needs and in their distractions from the stresses they're under. I'm afraid the only thing that's going to shake sufficient numbers out of that and into urgent action are terrible events. There are going to be terrible events, whether it's something like a nuclear war, further nuclear disasters, any of the aspects of the human emergency, or things we can't even foresee. When people are really hurt, and when in large numbers, it brings out something wonderful in them, I'm afraid. It brings out the strength that's enabled us to survive for 250,000 years. It bonds people who've been hurt together. Certainly numbers are on the side of the people. It's something like 95 to 5% populace versus ruling elites. It doesn't take 95% of a population to corner its ruling elites into needing to concede. Revolutions, I would guess, typically involve 10, 20, maybe at most 30% of populations. Revolution meaning something that causes a fundamental change in the system, not necessarily an overthrow of the system. So I'm afraid that the disasters that are bound to come are what are going to galvanize people. I only hope that there is an increasing awareness that the problem is really in power itself, in the system of corporate management implemented through the state, so that when people are enraged, they'll know what the problem is to address. It's good to know the problem, but you've got to be really motivated in large numbers, and preferably with some organization, to confront those in power in a way that they can't resist, that they can't either mollify or buy off or crush.
Well, I mean, in terms of disasters, you do have to wonder what it would take. For example, I remember when Chernobyl happened, and the reaction, obviously we didn't have quite the global media we have today. Certainly there was no internet, but I remember a huge furore about it. And I was living in the west of Ireland, and we were told about sheep had been irradiated, it had gone that far. You couldn't touch it, you couldn't smell it, couldn't sense it was there really without a Geiger counter or something. But there was this great sense of concern, and you look at the triviality of that in comparison to Fukushima, which is ongoing and like so much bigger. I can't remember the figures, is it 60 or 70 times bigger? And I'm not saying there's apathy around it, but certainly there's a general kind of ho-hum. Hasn't affected us yet. And certainly in Japan, there's everyone running around, establishment, media, government running around trying to say, no problem here, move along.
I don't know what to say. Radiation is a really insidious kind of disaster because it isn't palpable. You can say, well, the Geiger counters are saying this and the chemical tests are saying this and blah, blah, blah. But you can be exposed to huge amounts of radiation and only get a little bit sick. And you can be exposed to amounts that are going to cause birth defects and cancer down the road and never know a thing. So it's in the head.
Whereas I suppose something like Hurricane Katrina, for example, I mean, we're not talking about natural disasters or necessarily man-made disasters. Could be anything, but all,
it can be anything.
All stemming from the system. But I suppose something very physical and visceral like Katrina is kind of like, it's especially for whether you're watching it on TV or whether you're directly affected, it's very difficult just to go about your everyday business without going, holy cow, look at that.
Yeah. Again, I say I can't predict the future. I can't say it would take this kind of disaster, but it's got to be something that really hurts in a visible way, and I'm afraid those are going to happen. Maybe we're doomed. Sometimes I feel it. Sometimes I feel that the thought control system is so effective, and the system is so far over the edge, and so much damage has already been done to the environment, to the climate. The conflict that's been generated around the world is so irreparable. Maybe we're doomed, but maybe we aren't. We're an incredible species, and if this engine could be invented and cause so much damage, I believe we've got it in us as a community, as a world of communities of human beings. We've got it in us to find a way to throttle it back and ultimately get rid of it if we have enough time left to do it. I don't try to foresee whether we can, but I know we've got to act as if we might, or we're never going to do a thing.
One of the issues is, of course, that in the times that we live in, we see it now every night on the on the regular news, is how dissent is slapped down. And I know we're talking a moment ago about the popular attitude amongst everyday people. Folks I talk to, how, even if they're not particularly engaged with these important issues, they're aware of what happens to people. Even if they go and protest these days, you can come back with a face full of tear gas and a billy club round the head for not doing anything at all other than holding up a placard. And whether it's a dissenting political party, a small group trying to get together, whether it's an environmental organisation or whether it's a group of concerned citizens, I look at it's not quite so bad here in the UK, but I look at, for example, the G8 and G20, whatever the hell they are, whatever alphabet soup the latest is, and there's protesters there, and the US police, and that's right out of science fiction. I mean, those guys look like 7-foot-tall RoboCops, like they're going into serious battle, and all they're doing is just facing down ordinary people who are just concerned.
Which means that those in power know that there's a threat. The militarization of police in the United States is a big issue with some people here. The way even not large cities, but some reasonably small-sized cities are equipping their police with tanks, riot police and so forth. Those in power are bracing for a rebellion. And I think they know something that many people don't. They know that there is going to be rage in this country, and I'm sure the same is true around the world, where police have typically been more militarized in many places than in the U.S. They're bracing for nothing less than an uprising. They aren't bracing for some kind of riot where a few angry people go out and smash shop windows. They're bracing for the population to turn against those in power. And I don't believe they're mistaken. I think they have their finger on the pulse of the people they're controlling, and they can't foresee what may cause the uprising any better than I can. But they wouldn't be preparing for it if they didn't foresee that it was an imminent possibility.
Now, towards the end of the book, you turn to what you think perhaps some of the strategies perhaps we can pursue in order to do something about this, possibly. You also address some non-solutions. For example, in the context of what you've just been saying, that to mount organised military force against, the controlling elite is not feasible because they always will have overwhelming firepower. But what are some of the strategies that people can consider? Whether it's in groups or individually, however, within or without the mainstream societal structure.
Well, I certainly can't provide any kind of recipe or formula for how to confront domination. But I think since modern power rests on thought control to a degree that was never the case before, that's its greatest vulnerability. And that if there's one thing that people can do in addition to all the things that people have done forever, agitating, protesting, organizing unions and community associations, all that kind of stuff. In addition to that, if people can find ways to confront the thought control system in their daily community lives, challenging the things that everybody is taught to believe, challenging the sources of information, challenging the authorities, setting an example of being a thoughtful person who does not buy into that stuff and who is not jerked around by it. If there's anything we could add to the mix that might make it more volatile, it's to directly challenge this unprecedented and incredibly sophisticated thought control system that we have. Not sure how to do that in any but very informal ways. Talk about politics, talk about ideas, talk about issues, talk about where people get their ideas, talk about, above all, education, which is really quite a scandal here in the United States. That's the weakest point because modern power depends on it more than really anything else. There's not that much threat of physical force here in the United States, for example, today. The force of control is by first keeping as many people complacent and indifferent and uninformed as possible, and then sharply controlling the thoughts and the terms of debate among those who do pay attention to what's going on. If that system could be destabilized, all of the other forces for change would gain a tremendous new momentum, and the stability of the system might even falter. That's what I suggest in my book anyway, not as a plan of action that I think will do the trick, because I don't think there's a trick to be done like that missile up the little hole in the Death Star, but just as what seems like a reasonable response to a situation where political power has a vulnerability it never really had before. And the peoples at this point still have the freedom to exploit that vulnerability and to see what happens if you poke at it.
Well, the internet's been a great facilitator. I think I'm not sure if anything like that has ever existed. I say not sure simply because there's questions about ancient civilizations, in high antiquity, and who knows what they could do. But in the era of human existence that as far as we're aware of, this sort of global network is unique. And as well as considering the possibilities there, you do, at the end of the book, look beyond all of this. And I think that's worth doing as well, their imagination, and just to think about how things could be and how they were. It's important to remember this is quite a blip, really, in human history, what we're seeing now. And ultimately, the human nature we've been talking so much about, in that's where you see hope, not in a lot of people's conditioned view that it's human nature that's brought us here. It isn't.
I think if we can survive the threat of the human emergency and at least dramatically throttle back political power, greatly reduce conflict, greatly reduce the armaments, and especially the aggressive armaments of all the powerful states in the world, then this human ingenuity and this thriving for the common good of communities can bring about, just on that limited basis, we could see a world that's better than it's ever been, really, and that's certainly more peaceful and cooperative than it's been for 6,000 years. If we can completely get rid of domination, if we can have the whole mechanism of domesticating communities abolished and banned, and leave human ingenuity really free to create forms of community that suit each community's own needs and that interact with the communities around them in peaceful, cooperative ways, then I think we stand a chance at a really wonderful future for this planet. Nothing like utopia. There will always be problems. There will always be conflicts. There will always be unintended consequences of anything we do. But freed from war and the intensification of power and the destruction of the habitat and the throttling of human ingenuity through domestication, then we've got a shot at least as long another good period of at least as long a period of thriving human communities as we've had here on this planet so far. No idea whether that's possible. The reforms are really possible if the human emergency doesn't do us in first.
I think personally my greatest hope, and I know hope, as they say, some people say is useless really in some sense, but in the sense that it is of use to us, my greatest hope is that lies in, I should say, that this idea that things haven't always been like this, that a lot of the people in power, the elites, would like us to believe that for better or worse, struggle and strife, it's been like an arrow, a one-way line that's brought us from our prehistoric past to where we are now, and it must necessarily continue more or less in this form off into the future. I don't think it's like that at all. I think the future could look radically different. It might be different in some ways that are not so good. Maybe we won't have all the things that we do now, but maybe a lot of the things that we have now that we don't want, they'll be gone as well. So there's just the possibility that over the big cycles that people quite often don't think about in their day-to-day lives, that therein lies the hope. And you and I probably won't see it in our lifetimes, but we know that life goes on. I think it will, unless, of course, as you say, the human emergency catches everything, wipes it out. But I ultimately don't think that even then, I think planet Earth will be here. I still think there'll be people here. I don't know what it'll look like, but I don't think over is really over in that sense.
All you have to do is look at the really incredible accomplishments of human ingenuity. And I don't mean things like computers. I mean things like like language, like literature, like cooking. You know, so somebody once said to me, "Oh, cooking, somebody came across an animal that had been charred in a forest fire and they found out it tasted good." Baloney, that doesn't explain cooking grains. If you look at the incredible accomplishments of human ingenuity and how human communities have thrived through difficulties before domination, 3 ice ages, changes of climate, all kinds of things, there really is a lot of hope that the future can be better than it is now and maybe good. And if we're going to get there, it'll be by unforeseeable combinations of people coming up with unforeseeable solutions to these problems that are so severe. I just think, as the engineers say, understanding the problem is 95% of solving it. If we really understand what we're up against and that ingenuity sets out to tackle it, there is a chance that the future can be something that we could be happy that our great-grandchildren will be living in.
Well, Mark, just to remind listeners today, we've been talking about your book. Once again, it's Engines of Domination, Political Power and the Human Emergency. But just before we wind things up, do you have a website or anything you'd like to share with listeners? I mean, certainly the book itself is widely available, all the usual outlets.
No, I sure don't. This has been a little home operation, and you can find the book at all the usual places. It's distributed by AK Press, and it's available on Amazon. It's just me working out of my little study here in New Mexico.
Oh, well, that's more than good enough. Listen, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
It's been a real pleasure, Greg. Thank you.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.